Americans, at least those of them dependent on the mainstream commercial media, clearly lived in a bubble of their own where this war was concerned. Inside this bubble, they were largely protected from hearing or seeing anything that would lead them to suspect that they were essentially being deceived. All others, the world over, everybody else on the face of the earth, had the opportunity to know what was actually going on in Gaza. Now, this group of others actually included increasing numbers of Americans, mainly young Americans who were not dependent on the mainstream media and who had alternate sources of information. It included as well Israelis. Now, Israelis overwhelmingly supported their country's military offensive, but Israelis had ample access to information from both sides and had ample access to sharply dissident views in their press daily. These views from respected voices like Gideon Levy, Tom Segev, Akiva Eldar, B. Michael, Meron Ben-Ministi, I could go on, there are dozens of them, were far more savagely critical of their own country's actions than anything published anywhere in the American press since this conflict began. Almost entirely absent in what was said and published in the United States from the beginning of the Gaza war until today was any reference to international or US law. This is in keeping with the way the larger conflict in the Middle East has been treated in the media and increasingly in US policy. Law is almost always ignored. The contrast with the transition from the Bush regime to the Obama administration could not be more striking. As we were all able to observe, the 2008 election, the endless 2008 election campaign, and the presidential transition we just witnessed featured extensive attention to a number of issues, which I want to then reflect on. Among them were the constitutional limitations on the actions of the president and his administration in conditions of war, his or her administration in conditions of war. Among them were the terms and conditions of incarceration of detainees captured on foreign battlefields who are not technically prisoners of war. Among them were questions of interrogation and torture. Among them were respect for international law and treaties. And among them were a reassessment, or a consideration and a reassessment of the attitude of the United States to the United Nations. In this transition, in this election and then in this transition, a new spirit of concern for law, international and American, and of respect for the United Nations seemed abroad in the land. Sadly, we see little evidence of a new spirit regarding the importance of law and how the Arab-Israeli conflict in general and the war in Gaza specifically is regarded in this country. Now, insofar as the kinds of constitutional issues that some of which Naomi talked about and others are concerned, this is somewhat understandable. There is, in fact, no comparison. Israel does not have a constitution or a presidential system of government, so the kinds of questions you might ask are not really easily translatable. Moreover, Israel, for 41 and a half years and counting, has ruled over 4 million captive Palestinians living under its military occupation, under a peculiar system which has more in common with the arbitrariness of prison administration than any constitutional system or system of law. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority, which is incidentally a misnomer if ever there was one, for an entity that has almost no authority, not to speak of no sovereignty, no jurisdiction, and no power. The Palestinian Authority is currently in a constitutional shambles. It has a quote-unquote president whose term ended on the 9th of January. It has two rival governments with de facto control over two parts of its non-contiguous territories, over which it does not in any case have sovereignty, jurisdiction, or authority. And it has a legislative council, still with 2 years to go in its term, but many of whose members are in Israeli detention. The surrounding Arab states, with the sole exception of Lebanon, are barely veiled autocracies where the will of the ruler is supreme and where the rule of law is strictly subordinated to brutal concerns of state security. It is thus impossible in any of these cases to discuss American-style constitutional questions about limitations of the power of the executive in times of war or freedoms such as we enjoy under the Bill of Rights, or any of the other niceties we in the United States justly take pride in. Nevertheless, there are many areas where the kinds of legal issues that have come up during our election and in our presidential transition are relevant. The legal framework for detention and the employment of torture are excellent examples. Israel currently holds nearly 11,000 Palestinian detainees in its gulag of prisons. Several hundred of them are so-called administrative detainees. These individuals are held for 6-month terms that can be and often are continued for years on end without charge, trial, or conviction. They never go before a judge, they have no lawyers, they don't know why they're there, they can be kept there indefinitely. Some of them are kept there literally for year after year after year. This is a legal holdover taken directly from the emergency regulations of the odious British colonial authorities in Palestine before 1948. The same emergency regulations were kept in force by the State of Israel. The other 10,000 or so detainees have been rapidly processed by the kangaroo court system of Israeli military justice. A strikingly large proportion of the adult male population of the occupied territories, perhaps as high as 40%, more by some estimates, have been through this system at one time or another. This indicates that the occupation regime essentially criminalizes people simply for being Palestinian. This is the functional equivalent of the crime in some American jurisdictions of driving while black. In this case, it could be called breathing while Palestinian. As for torture, the Israeli military court system is not only subject to the Israeli High Court, an institution which has rendered groundbreaking rulings against torture. I know about this case because one of my students actually worked on it. She was one of the lawyers who brought suit against torture in the Israeli High Court. These rulings by the High Court against torture were based in part on the observation by one of the lawyers who was involved in this case, based on materials she was able to subpoena, that torture in Israeli prisons, justified in this case as in so many others by the ticking bomb scenario. We had to torture them because they would commit a horrible crime in which innocent civilians would die. We had to torture them to get the ticking bomb scenario. You've certainly heard this before. This torture justified, as I say, by this scenario, she found from the records, always ceased on the eve of the Sabbath and then resumed on Sunday, the first 14th day thereafter. Presumably the bomb stopped ticking for the Sabbath, and the High Court, to its credit, noticed this anomaly and threw out torture. This landmark Israeli High Court decision, it should be noted, was later on circumvented by the Israeli military and the General Security Services, the Shabak, so-called, which continue to use most of the methods outlawed by our president yesterday when he issued an executive order that all interrogations by all branches of the United States government, including the CIA, must be subject to the rules governing the uniform American military. No such restrictions operate in the Israeli case, and that High Court ruling has been circumvented. The Israeli High Court, it should also be noted, at the beginning of the war in Gaza, issued a ruling in favor of the Association of Foreign Journalists in Israel, who were trying to be allowed into Gaza. As you might have guessed, this ruling was also flouted by the Israeli military on the customary grounds of security. They said that these journalists' personal security couldn't be guaranteed, and they said, we don't want you to guarantee our security, but they never let them